Yeah, anything else?
Are we already live?
Yeah, we're live, but
I think so.
Okay.
how many people responded? We had it. So hopefully we'll have a good turnout. I don't know. It's also live on Facebook, isn't it?
Yes.
Yeah, so not everybody will be on the Zoom call.
And we could tell people it's a little late now to share on their Facebook.
It's live on YouTube, not Facebook, but I will tell folks to share on their Facebooks and so on.
It must be early evening in Europe.
Well, it's 4 o'clock.
Oh, 4 o'clock.
I mean, depending where you are. In London, if you are in Amsterdam or in Berlin, it would be 5 o'clock.
Oh, I see, I see. I was actually, I was a fellow at the Central European University in Budapest until the end of February. It was my first time, I was there for 5 months, and it was my first time living in any part of Europe, and it was such an interesting experience.
Wow. Yeah. Well,
Yeah, especially being in Hungary. I mean,
yeah, exactly. That's been quite intense.
yeah.
So we ready, Ariel?
There's a
Yeah.
message that says nothing is happening on YouTube.
Did Ariel say we should start?
Yes, go ahead and start.
Well, hello to everybody. We're very excited about what we consider a really historic webinar, having women from various, representing various parts of the world, talking about the impact of sanctions from a gender perspective. My name is Medea Benjamin. I'm with the group CODEPINK, and we are co-sponsoring this with Sussan Tahmasebi from FEMENA, who's going to talk about her group, and also from a coalition called Sanctions Kill. And we're going to start in, looking at this from the point of view of what has happened historically using sanctions, but also in some cases, what has happened under the Trump administration and how sanctions have increased as a weapon of war affecting the majority of people in the countries that are sanctioned. And so I want to turn it over to the co-moderator, Sussan. Thank you for organizing this, and we're very excited to be working with you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Medea. It's really my pleasure to be co-organizing this really important event. As Medea said, I'm Sussan Tahmasebi. I'm the director of FEMENA. FEMENA is a new organization, and we work to support women in the Middle East and North Africa and in some Asian countries by supporting women human rights defenders, their organizations, and their movements. We try to raise awareness about issues of concern to women activists on the ground. One of the issues of concern to activists, especially in the MENA region, has been the use of sanctions and how it's impacting women and other vulnerable communities. So this is hopefully will be part of a longer running series where we try to bring attention to the issue of sanctions, the gendered impact of sanctions, and how they are impacting women and other vulnerable communities, and in particularly women's ability to organize. So it's really my pleasure to have these excellent speakers and researchers with us today. I'm going to start with introducing Nadje Al-Ali, whose work I've followed for a long time. And she's done incredible work documenting the impact of sanctions and war on women in Iraq. Nadje is the Robert Family Professor of International Studies and Professor of Anthropology and Middle East Studies at Brown University. Her main research interests revolve around feminist activism and gendered mobilization, with a focus on Iraq, Egypt, Lebanon, Turkey, and the Kurdish political movement. She has many publications, and they include What Kind of Liberation? Women in the Occupation of Iraq, Women in War in the Middle East, Transnational Perspectives, and Iraqi Women Untold Stories from 1948 to the present. And Secularism, Gender, and State in the Middle East. Her co-edited book with Deborah Al-Najjar, entitled We Are Iraqis, Aesthetics and Politics in a Time of War, which was published by Syracuse University Press, won the 2014 Arab American Book Prize for Nonfiction. And Nadje is also an activist. She has a long history of activism, and she's also on the advisory board of COL, a journal of body and gender research, which is one of my favorite publications in the region. So thank you very much, Nadje, for joining us. Tell us, the sanctions against Iraq were so extreme that the world community, the UN afterwards, decided that they will never, ever have a similar experience, and they'll never, ever implement similar sanctions ever again. So tell us just a little bit about what those sanctions entailed and what was their impact on women and also on more vulnerable communities in Iraq, so that we can have a very historic perspective when we talk about sanctions.
Thanks so much, Sussan and Medea, for organizing this and inviting me. Particularly, I'm pleased that you are thinking about Iraq, because I'm quite frustrated by the general amnesia about the impact of 13 years of the most comprehensive sanction system ever imposed on a country. And I mean, even there is amnesia now about the impact of the invasion and occupation on Iraq. But in my view, we are actually not able to fully comprehend the impact of the invasion without looking at the previous impact of sanctions. And sanctions, I mean, there were obvious, most devastating impacts that affected the whole society. So there was dramatic increased child mortality. There was terrible unemployment, increase in poverty, widespread malnutrition, generally infrastructure, particularly when it comes to health services and education, deteriorated incredibly. I mean, to just give you some figures, according to UNICEF, at the height of the sanctions regime, about 5,000 children died as the direct impact of sanctions. And so this is sort of the general picture, devastation in terms of the overall economy and social infrastructure. However, women were particularly affected by sanctions. And this was for several reasons. One reason, the Iraqi state, I mean, however authoritarian and repressive the regime of Saddam Hussein was, and it was very repressive, there was a welfare state and structure of welfare provision in place. So for example, childcare was free, there was a good healthcare system, transportation to schools and to the workplace were free. And actually the state encouraged women to be not only educated, but part of the labor force. And during the sanctions period, as Iraq experienced a severe economic crisis, and of course, alongside came widespread unemployment, women were pushed back into the home. And I think it's really important to understand that this has nothing to do with culture or religion. Anywhere in the world where a country experiences economic crisis, and we're actually right now experiencing it globally, women are being pushed back. It's women are supposed to go back to their traditional roles of, caregivers, looking after children, looking after households, while the few existing jobs are for men. And this is exactly what happened in Iraq in terms of a change of policy, a change of attitude. There was a general shift of climate in terms of gender norms and relations, and a much greater social conservatism in the context of sanctions. And I mean, again, here we need to historicize, because of course the sanctions, before the sanctions, we had the 8-year-long war with Iran from 1980 to 88. And during that time, we already had a shift towards greater religiosity in Iraq. The Ba'ath regime, we need to sort of remember, was of course a largely secular regime following Arab nationalist ideology, Iraqi nationalist ideology. But people started to become more religious during the Iran-Iraq war. And in many ways, the opposition to the secular authoritarian regime was often expressed in religion. But what happened during the sanctions period, you had the combination of this shift towards religiosity, towards a much greater social conservatism, for several reasons. One reason was that because of the fact that there were so many households that were female-headed households, so many widows because of the previous wars, there was a demographic imbalance in Iraq. And for many women, the only way to survive was to engage in sex work. And at some point, the Jordanian government actually complained, because there were Iraqi women who in Amman, neighboring Amman, were engaged in sex work. And so this created a scandal. And following this, Saddam Hussein and his son Uday engaged in this terrible campaign that, killing some sex workers and also alleged pimps. And that created this incredible fear amongst people. So families, parents became much stricter in terms of young women's mobility, in terms of dress code. So there was definitely a shift, much more restricted mobility, while previously it was quite okay. I mean, many of the women I interviewed who were at university during the 90s told me that before the sanctions period, and also asking their mothers, they were able to just go out to a cafe or ice cream or just walk in the park after university. But society became much more conservative. Also, polygamy. I mean, polygamy was virtually unknown in Iraq. So I have a very large extended family. My father is Iraqi. And there was one uncle, actually one cousin of my father, who had a second wife. I cannot emphasize how much he was subject of ridicule and jokes. I mean, it was not considered to be normal to have a second wife, right? But in the context of sanctions, as there was a demographic imbalance, but what I mean by demographic imbalance, there were more women than men, and you had unemployment, you had a terrible economic crisis. More women accepted to get married as a second wife, and more families also accepted their daughters to get married as a second wife. And again, we cannot say this is because of Iraqi culture or because of Islam. It's because of changing economic circumstances. So what we really saw during the sanctions period was that the two support systems that women had, one was the state. And again, when I say support by the state, I'm in no way denying the human rights abuses and the repression by the state. But what I'm talking about childcare, I'm talking about transportation to work, I'm talking about generous maternity benefits. I mean, all this fell away. On the other hand, the other support system that was very important were extended families. But during the sanctions period, there was also a shift towards the nuclear family, as everyone was kind of fighting for themselves. And so, at the height of the sanctions period, over 60% of Iraqis were reliant on the monthly food rations given out by the government. So in a very paradoxical way, sanctions had actually the opposite effect in terms of actually strengthening the stronghold of the regime on its population, because only people who are registered, could receive the monthly food rations. And so many of the women I talked to at the time when I did the research for my book, and today as well, when I speak to friends and families and colleagues, they always stress how during the 90s, many working women also stopped working because they simply could not afford working anymore, because the government was not able to pay salaries, and women in the Middle East, as in many countries in the global South, are disproportionately presented in the public sector, and that was the same case in Iraq. And so women who were teachers, or they were doctors, or they were working as and engineers and so on, they hardly received a salary anymore. But now they had to pay the transportation to work, they had to pay transportation to school. Also, there was increase in criminality, and so several women told me, well, even if I could have afforded to go to work, I did not feel safe to leave my children at home anymore. And several people told me that, again, despite the political repression during the Ba'ath regime, people felt safe, as in they would leave their doors open. That was not possible anymore during the sanctions period, where clearly, because people were starving, people were unemployed, there was a much greater rate of criminality. So I will stop here. I mean, there are lots of other details, but I mean, overall, I think it's really important to understand that economic sanctions, maybe more profoundly than the Gulf War in 1991, destroyed Iraqi society and changed it in a way that had long-lasting impacts, and that very much also explained some of the developments in terms of the rise in sectarianism and Islamist militia following the invasion of Iraq in 2003.
Thank you very much, Nadje. That's really informative. And a number of years ago, I did some research and a publication on the impact of sanctions in Iran, and sent it to a group of people that we knew. And one Iraqi woman wrote back and said, this is exactly what happened in Iraq, that, before the invasion of Iraq, that, sanctions had already decimated society beforehand. So we see similar developments in other contexts. And almost 20 years or 30 years after the start of this, Iraqi society is by no means better, it's much worse. So it's really a very sad state. I'm going to turn it over to Medea so that she can move on to Venezuela, North Korea. So.
Yes, thank you so much, Nadje. It's painful to think of what the US has done over so many years to the Iraqi society, and important for us to understand how sanctions, the effect of them don't disappear when the sanctions are lifted. So thank you so much for giving us that historic and present day understanding of the terrible effects of sanctions on the society, and particularly on women. We're going now to Suzy Kim, who is a historian of modern Korea, serves on the faculty of Rutgers University. She guest edited a volume, Cross Currents, East Asia History and Culture Review, and wrote the award-winning book, Everyday Life in the North Korean Revolution, 1945 to 1950. She also is a peace and social justice activist. I know her from working on Women Cross the DMZ, a fantastic group of women who went from North Korea to South Korea and continue to work to try to bring peace to the Korean Peninsula. And Suzy is also a co-writer on a very important report that came out recently that is called The Human Cost and Gendered Impact of Sanctions on North Korea. So thank you so much for joining us, Suzy.
Thank you, Medea, and thank you, both you and Sussan, for organizing this important webinar. What I'm struck by just listening to Nadje was, the fact that this kind of blanket tool that they use in foreign policy, namely sanctions, has affected so many different societies, and the effects are very similar. And in actuality, the report that Medea just mentioned that we published in October of just this past year, we benefited a lot actually from research that was done about the impact of sanctions in Iraq and the ways in which there were so many similarities with the impact that the sanctions were having in North Korea as well. I don't know how many people joining us on the webinar were able to see the news this morning. Some disturbing news coming from the Korean Peninsula. The Korean Peninsula, actually, that there was a liaison office that was set up that allowed communication between the North and the South in Korea, that was set up in Kaesong, which is one of the places that we actually visited with Medea and I when we crossed the DMZ in 2015. That liaison office apparently was blown up early this morning, afternoon local time, by North Korea. And one of the reasons why it was blown up, actually, I think we can connect it to the discussion today about sanctions. I don't know how many people remember, but 2018, which was only 2 years ago, was a very different time. Things were looking very positive and hopeful on the Korean Peninsula. There were various summits that happened not only between North and South Korea, but also the historic summit that happened between President Trump and Chairman Kim Jong-un of North Korea. And it seemed as if this 70-year conflict between North Korea and the US might finally be coming to an end. But of course, we haven't seen any progress since that time, and things have only gotten worse. And one of the promises that were actually made in 2018 during that summit between the US and North Korea was that potentially sanctions could be lifted in exchange for North Korean promises of denuclearizing their weapons program. And so, but of course, there hasn't been any lifting of sanctions. And so I think some analysts are basically looking at this, the blowing up of the liaison office, as not just a signal to South Korea, but that it could potentially also mean signaling to the US about not keeping its promises to engage and lift some of the sanctions as a way forward. And so I think, you know, we can think about the way that the sanctions impact everyday lives, which I'll get into now, but it has major reverberations and ramifications all the way from, you know, the very top level foreign policy and relations between states, all the way down to the way that I think it affects people. And the reason why I bring up the importance of the foreign relations is because essentially, if there's no headway made in terms of improving relations between the US and North Korea, basically any hope of lifting the current sanctions regime that is in place is lost. And the impact only just grows. And as Nadje pointed out, even after the sanctions are lifted, the impact of what happens during that time just continues on, and it's very difficult to reverse some of those effects. And so I think it's absolutely imperative to try to mediate some of the effects of these sanctions now. Let me just give a very brief, I feel like I'm going on too much, but just in a nutshell, arguably, probably the sanctions against North Korea is one of the oldest globally. North Korea and the US have essentially been technically in a state of war since the Korean War began in 1950. And some of the sanctions actually go as far back as that. Having said that, the current sanctions regime really began in 2006 when North Korea tested its first nuclear test. And so then it began a whole series of sanctions. The interesting thing about the so-called first generation of sanctions that lasted between 2006 and 2016 was that the UN, having learned from some of the terrible effects of the sanctions in Iraq, actually labeled these first generations of sanctions against North Korea as smart sanctions. In other words, they were very targeted to ban luxury goods, for example, targeting the elite, or they banned weapons components to prevent the weapons development. And presumably these were supposed to be smart, but as we often know, they weren't so smart because so many components were considered dual use. So in other words, things like computer components or X-ray technology, components that might go into, for example, an ultrasound machine, a lot of the medical equipment basically could not pass the test. And so they were also banned under the so-called smart sanctions. The smart sanctions were aggravated again in 2016 with the so-called second generation of sanctions. And these were basically in response to the fourth nuclear test that the North Koreans claimed was a hydrogen bomb test in 2016. So since 2016, there's been entire sectors of the North Korean economy, both imports and exports, that have now been banned. The top exports, for example, in minerals, seafood, and textile have been all banned. And textile, this tends to be true, I think, globally, but many of the workers in the textile industry tend to be women. I think in the North Korean case, about 80% of the textile workers tend to be women. And so this was devastating for the women workers in North Korea. And then in terms of imports, many of the energy needs, so natural gas, fuel, petroleum, these were also banned under the imports with the 2016 sanctions. And then as well as any metallic component. I mean, I can't imagine, so nails, staplers, that's just at the very bottom of the scale. So you can imagine the impact of that just reverberating throughout the entire country. When I visited North Korea in 2011 and 2013, this was even before the 2016 sanctions, but already the hospitals, we visited a maternity ward, the hospitals were really suffering because they couldn't import the components that would be needed to fix their machines. So they had basically this ultrasound machine that was, sitting there idle because they couldn't fix it. And obviously that affects maternal and reproductive health and impacting women. And I think I just wanted to echo what Nadje said about the fact that women oftentimes in many societies, including our own in the United States, have to carry on the double burden of not only working outside the home, but having to take care of their families. I think, despite all of the progress made in terms of, gender equality and all of that, women are still oftentimes the ones that are the primary caretakers, both within their families and in their societies. And so what ended up happening when some of the state resources were taken away, so the resources that were going into childcare or public education or public health care, when these resources were stripped, essentially then the burden of having to fill that role ended up falling on women. And so it aggravated some of the gender inequalities that were already in existence. And then also when the formal economy basically was suffering and there was a major economic crisis, women were now having to go more and more into some of the underground economy. So not only in terms of illicit trade and market economies that tend to be, it's looked upon negatively in socialist countries, but women basically ended up going into sex trafficking, became victims of sex trafficking, prostitution, and that sort of thing. And because it's not an area where there's a whole lot of government oversight or public protection, women often ended up not having any recourse in terms of getting any justice when they were exposed to sexual harassment or sexual violence, including domestic violence. I think, I'm assuming my time is up. So I'll end it there for now.
Yeah, thank you. Did you want to make a comment, Medea?
Oh, no, I thought we would go on to our next speakers and then come back. Okay,
great. Thank you so much, Suzy. This is it was really fascinating hearing about North Korea. Our next speaker is Azadeh Moaveni. She is Crisis Group's Gender Project Director. Prior to joining, she is, International Crisis Group's Gender Project Director. Prior to joining International Crisis Group, she worked in academia as senior lecturer in journalism at New York University in London and Kingston University with a focus on conflict reporting. Azadeh also worked across the MENA region for over a decade as a correspondent for Time magazine and other publications, and traveled to Afghanistan, measuring progress of UNDP programs intended to enhance women's security and political participation. She has written a number of books, 2 books about youth and women's culture in Iran. She co-authored Shirin Ebadi's memoir. Shirin Ebadi is the Iranian Nobel Peace Laureate. The memoir is called Iran Awakening, and her latest book is about women who join ISIS. The book is titled Guest House for Young Widows, and it is getting a lot of positive reviews and attention. We're really delighted to have you here today with us, Azadeh. Suzy mentioned that North Korea has been sanctioned for over 50 years. Iran has been sanctioned for over 40 years. But the sanctions that Iran faces now are a little bit different. Tell us a little bit about what those sanctions regimes are, right? And what the impact it is on women and other vulnerable communities.
Well, thank you very much, Sussan and Medea, and so good to be here with all of you, hearing about all of these experiences across our societies that resonate so much. As you said, Sussan, Iran also has faced generations of sanctions. I'm going to focus today on the most contemporary ones that came back that were reimposed by the Trump administration in 2018. The kind of political backdrop, of course, is that in 2015, Iran and the United States and a number of other countries signed a multilateral nuclear deal in exchange for which Iran was supposed to experience the sort of layered lifting of many sanctions that had been imposed on it. And under the Obama administration, that process began. In 2018, when the Trump administration moved to come out of the nuclear deal, it began to reimpose, sort of in a layered manner, a tranche of those sanctions, to the point where we are today, where essentially Iran's banking, oil, and gas sectors are all sanctioned. These are, of course, unilateral American sanctions. To kind of widen the lens, though, of the ways that these sanctions work, the United States also imposes secondary sanctions on other countries that are seeking to do trade with Iran. So in effect, the US has been using the primacy of the US dollar as the international reserve currency and the US banking system as a sort of international financial clearinghouse to just turn the taps off on the Iranian economy total. This campaign is called Maximum Pressure by the Trump administration, and it comes with other tools. And the sort of seeming political aim of it is to lock the US into a confrontational dynamic with Iran, potentially a future military confrontation, locking in a web, you could say, of sanctions that will be increasingly difficult for any future US administration to undo, should it want to maneuver differently diplomatically to come back into the nuclear deal or to negotiate a new one. I think it's also important to say that the US is operating adjacently to this in other areas as well, beyond sanctions, just to really convey the totalizing nature of this effort, going so far as to try and block Iran's request for a loan from the IMF to receive COVID relief, or relief from what its economy is experiencing in the aftermath of the COVID pandemic. The US presses ahead with this despite having a breakdown with its European allies who do not share this approach, who were signatories to that nuclear deal. The Europeans have tried quite haltingly to set up other channels so they can be autonomous of this, to continue some trade with Iran, and importantly, to ensure that there's a humanitarian channel so that Iran can at least import humanitarian goods, medicines, and other essential items, using its own currency on the international market. That effort has been largely unsuccessful, and we saw that in really vivid display during the COVID crisis. when Iran's, the government's response to COVID was severely hampered by sanctions. It simply could not scale up to buy the ingredients it needed to manufacture its own PPE. It could not import basic medicines and disinfectants. The effect was a total calamity. Iran was the hardest hit country by COVID, and at a certain point at the beginning of around Persian New Year, there is one Iranian dying every 10 minutes from COVID. The relationship between this and sanctions is utterly clear because Iran's health infrastructure is quite strong. It has been a regional hub for medical tourism for a very long time. So simply it was the access to buy extra equipment, scale up, and be able to manufacture its own response. So essentially, the economic crisis that Iran was experiencing before the pandemic has been dramatically exacerbated by it. The economy was reeling already. Its currency, the Iranian currency, has collapsed. Inflation has been hovering between 30 and 40%. Everyone is impacted by this, but prominently women, and in a particular way, women. In the 2010s, we saw a real flourishing in Iran of women-owned businesses, women increasingly active in sectors that they were able to access and engage in more readily: online clothing, retail, cafes, restaurants, entrepreneurial businesses. These were sectors that worked well for women because they could control their hours and their workload. They could avoid some of their vulnerability to workplace exploitation and harassment that they might encounter in other sectors. And women's activity in these kind of spheres really flourished. As the Trump administration reimposed sanctions in 2018, the currency tanked and families saw their purchasing power and their ability to spend dramatically and immediately curtailed. They immediately changed how they spent in the economy, of course. They were no longer going out to eat, to buy clothes, to essentially frequent this whole sort of sector in which women were so active. So small shops and retailers saw their revenue drop, their rents of course skyrocketed because of inflation, and many women who had come into this sort of entrepreneurial sphere started going out of business, of course losing economically, but also losing what it would mean in their lives to be financially independent. Sanctions have also forced hundreds of foreign firms to close shop and leave the Iranian market, so laying off Iranian workers. And it's important to say, I mean, we are sort of in the long game of these really crushing US sanctions. We may be still in early days, but the sort of evaporation of foreign companies from the Iranian economic sphere is quite significant. Iran has 80 million population, of which sort of skilled, university-educated women are a real force. These companies were places where offered workspaces for women that were very empowering. They set high standards. They offered higher salaries. They were more professionally managed. They set better standards of workplace conduct. And Iranian firms were starting to compete because they wanted to be able to draw, of course, the same sort of skilled women into their workplaces. So Iranian firms were starting to have organized things like anti-sexual harassment training, trying to bring themselves up to be competitive with these European firms. So the sort of flight of the European firms kind of brought a halt not only to that whole sphere that was employing many skilled women, but halted the progress that it was enabling and encouraging for the rest of the economic sphere. Iran has tried to build resilience in the face of these sanctions by building up its manufacturing economy. This has good potential for women because Iranian women tend to fare better in the private sector. They are employed at a higher rate. They tend to ascend to higher management positions. But again, another sector that looks to be the target of further US sanctions is the manufacturing center. So sort of looking behind the economic story, of course, we go to the story of the secondary impact of these sanctions. I think we are at a point in Iran's experience with these really devastating oil, gas, and banking sector sanctions, again, somewhat early days, but I think we can immediately see some impacts. The rise in household tensions, especially among working class Iranians, which we have seen, I think, as Nadje mentioned, an epidemic globally now that we see is interrelated with domestic violence. The deterioration of women's educational prospects and travel abroad. The tanking of the currency means that all those numbers of Iranian women that were able to travel in the region, were able to seek out higher education in the region, university, traveling in the region or abroad beyond in Asia and Europe for language training or for higher academic training, simply can't afford to do that anymore. So it's a sort of shrinking of the participatory space for women too, whether it is attending sports matches and different kinds of international competitions. So it seems to have immediately meant that Iranian middle and working class families in their respective spheres have seen their ability to simply move around the region immediately curtailed. Sussan and I were speaking earlier in this week about how it reminds us of the late 90s when we both started working in Iran, and the isolation of that time, the difficulties that Iranians faced for a host of reasons, economically and otherwise, sort of seems to be pushing Iranians back into that kind of isolation. And of course, with significant implications for women who would seek out those kind of opportunities simply because overrepresented, the majority of university entrants coming out highly skilled in an economy that already had a glass ceiling and that had shrinking opportunities for them because of the imposition of these sanctions. So I will stop there. I mean, I think it's a story that maps onto our earlier stories, and I think I anticipate that there will be resonances with Venezuela as well. So I shall stop. Thank you.
Thank you, Azadeh.
Wow.
You can.
So Azadeh, that was just a fantastic but heartbreaking look at what has happened to women, and it's just so unconscionable that the United States does so much of this in the name of helping the Iranian people, and then you see what actually happens to them. And it's also quite remarkable that now Venezuela and Iran have this connection, because really geographically and for many other reasons, there's no reason for them to be major trading partners, except that they are both under the thumb of the Trump administration. And it's also interesting to note that as much as the Trump administration has managed to stop trade with Iran in the outside world and with Venezuela in the outside world, they have not so far been able to stop trade between Iran and Venezuela, as witnessed in the recent ships that managed to go from Iran to Venezuela despite the threats by the Trump administration. So Lilia from Venezuela, Lilia Ramirez, we're so happy to have you. Lilia works in the socio-political and cultural area of the Institute for Advanced Studies in Venezuela. She obtained her doctorate at the Institute for Scientific Research in Venezuela in the area of social studies with a thesis on participatory democracy. She has also done a lot of work recently on migration of Venezuelans outside the country, with a particular focus on women and how the media is portraying this. And so we're delighted to have you with us today to talk about what kind of sanctions have been imposed on Venezuela and how we can see this through a gendered lens.
Hi, how are you? Hi, Medea. Hi, Sussan. Hi, all. I really would like to thank FEMENA and CODEPINK, as well as the fellow colleagues and all the participants, for this opportunity to talk about gender impact of sanctions imposed on Venezuelan people. It's commonly said that the U.S. Government sanctions on Venezuela began in 2015 with Obama administration, but in fact, there has been financial hostility against Venezuela since 2002, when we had the oil strike and the coup d'etat attempt. And Intesa company, as well as Bush administration, actively participated in that general oil strike that aimed to force new elections here. And then actions affecting PDVSA, the oil industry, the main oil industry, proved to be very efficient measures to blackmail Venezuelan people to pursue regime change. Because, you know, the economic system of Venezuela depends entirely on oil production, and its profits funds most of food and medicines imports, as well as the public power, gas, water system, health system. So later in 2005, the Bush administration first declared that Venezuela government had links with specially designated narcotics traffickers. This is very important because most sanctions on Venezuela have been based on the fact that the government of Venezuela has links with drug dealers. It's the main reason that we are being sanctioned nowadays. And in 2006, also with the Bush administration, the US government declared that the Venezuelan government was not fully cooperating with the United States anti-terrorism efforts, which was also one of the first reasons we were sanctioned. Then, from December 2014, the US government officially started to declare economic sanctions against Venezuela, affecting especially food and health systems. In August 2017, Trump administration escalated its unilateral coercive measures when PDVSA was pretty much cut off from most financial markets. And this loss in foreign exchange that we needed for vital imports of food, medicine, and productive inputs, and that was caused by the US sanctions, was one of the main shocks that pushed Venezuela into hyperinflation late in 2017. And that is one of the accelerated economic crisis that we're living nowadays. In 2019, also the Food Import and Distribution Program, also known as CLAPS, that are the local committees for supply and production. This program was also sanctioned, as well as an international company that sells food to Venezuela. That's one of the main cases that we're seeing now in the media with Alex Saab, who was detained in Cabo Verde, in Cape Verde, because he was trading with food to sell to Venezuelan government. Trump administration has been very clear in its intention to promote regime change in Venezuela through economic sanctions. And this is why many people here in Venezuela consider these sanctions to be a new method of war. You know, according to the Center for Economic and Policy Research in Washington, US sanctions on Venezuela have caused at least 40,000 deaths only between 2017 and 2018. And since 2017, there are at least 80,000 people with HIV who have not had access to state-subsidized antiretroviral treatment. In Venezuela, as in other countries like Iran and Iraq, the health system has been provided and subsidized by the government. It's pretty much public health system. So you can imagine the impact of the sanctions in this system. About 16,000 people who need dialysis have been also affected by US sanctions that prohibit medicines import, as well as another 16,000 people who need cancer treatment. 4 million people with diabetes or hypertension have not had access to insulin or cardiovascular medication that were ordinarily given by the state. For instance, in July 2017, Citibank refused to receive Venezuelan funds to import 3,000 doses of insulin. Also in October 2017, the US sanctions made it impossible for Venezuela to deposit in the Swiss bank UBS the funds approved by the government for vaccines. This caused a delay of 4 months in the purchase of vaccines, altering the whole vaccination schedules in the country. That is pretty much based on public health system. Venezuela is a country, as well as many others, that in which life care has been historically assigned to women. And it's not difficult to imagine the impact of US sanctions on women's life. I mean, I hear the history of Iran, of Iraq, and North Korea, and I see many elements that we're living right now in Venezuela.
One of those might be that we just lost the connection. We'll wait and see if Lilia, you could come back with us. But in the meantime, maybe we should go to our second round of discussions. Sussan, do you want to?
Sure. Of course, thank you, Lilia, and I hope you do manage to join us. And as Lilia was speaking, I was just thinking how the drafters of sanctions, they claim that these sanctions are supposed to be coercive measures against governments, but they actually have unintended consequences. That's what they call them. And those unintended consequences are on civilian populations and basically death and destruction. And so for me, it's interesting that repeatedly we have these unintended consequences, but that they keep implementing these sanctions anyway.
For Lilia, she was telling us how difficult it is to get electricity, how it's on and off, and that Venezuela has not been able to rebuild its electrical system because of the sanctions. And so that's why I think we just lost her now, but hopefully we will get her back on. Nadje.
She'll come back. So, I mean, as you were speaking, Nadje, and I think we spoke before, but one of the issues that came up in our discussions was really interesting to me, and we'd like you to maybe talk about it a little bit more, that there were tensions between those who were opposing sanctions against Iraq, you know, in particular when it came to the issue of human rights. And I see this played out in different ways when it comes to Iran as well. So it would be really interesting to hear about your experience and how you organized to respond to this issue. Both human rights and also oppose sanctions.
Yes. Yeah, at the time, so I was based in London for my PhD at SOAS, and there was quite a substantial anti-sanctions movement in the UK. And I myself and some of my Iraqi friends, you know, would go to meetings. I should say that I had been involved with Women in Black, and so many of the activists from Women in Black would also join the anti-sanctions events. And myself and many of my friends and colleagues often felt very uncomfortable, to put it mildly, with the way that predominantly British anti-sanctions activists, but I also found the same in the US, in the name of fighting British foreign policy and imperialism more widely, were actually being apologetic about the Iraqi regime and the atrocities of Saddam Hussein, more specifically, or the Ba'ath regime. And there was a kind of an unwillingness to actually address the profound and systematic human rights abuses, and also specifically the abuses and atrocities against women in Iraq. And every time, we would bring this up, we were told, this is not the time to be divisive. We have to be unified in the fight against US imperialism. And so many of us, especially, I myself, I had an uncle, executed by Saddam Hussein, and many of my friends and colleagues had experience with relatives or themselves having been imprisoned because they had been part of the political opposition, or some of their friends had been imprisoned, tortured, killed. So there was no way that we accepted this very one-sided approach by I would say, the Western left, to speak more broadly. And so in London, we started an organization called Act Together, Women Against Sanctions on Iraq, which later on, unfortunately, we had to change the name to Act Together, Women Against Sanctions and War in Iraq. And what we're trying to say is, yes, you can be anti-sanctions, you can be anti-war, and still be critical and opposed to dictatorial authoritarian regimes. Unfortunately, that political nuance is often missing. And I've been invited to some discussions, especially in the Iranian context, where I think it's very polarized as well. And this was also the same case, of course, after in the run-up and in the aftermath to the invasion of Iraq. So, either you were, even now when we speak about Iraq, yes, of course, I'm critical of US invasion or US-led invasion, and the UK as well. But, 17 years after the invasion of Iraq and the occupation of Iraq, we cannot talk about the devastation of Iraq without mentioning the corrupt, repressive Iraqi politicians as well, and the militia, and the sectarian Islamists. So I think one of the problems that I often see, and I'm more familiar with the Iranian case than the case of North Korea and Venezuela, is that anti-sanctions movements, as anti-war movements, tend to fall into this, you're either with us or against us, in this very sort of polarized manner, while I think it is, especially as a feminist, especially those of us who think of themselves as transnational feminists, we need to be, intersectional, and we need to be much more nuanced in our politics.
Thank you. Thank you very much. These are really important lessons for us working, for us Iranians working on this issue. And unfortunately for us, it seems that the cause of human rights has actually been taken up by pro-sanctions and pro-war, some of them pro-war, yes. pro-regime change, I would say.
Yeah. That was the same.
Because peace activists are reluctant to do it, especially going back to the Iraqi example, because human rights were used as an excuse for invasion. So you're right, feminist perspectives can really help in this.
Well, Suzy, I think this probably resonates a lot with you. I saw you shaking your head, and I want to say, as one of the Western feminists that probably has been accused of what Nadje has talked about, it's so difficult if you want to maintain relationships with people inside the country and you want access to get in the country. You also have to be careful about how you talk about the issues. And so, Suzy, I wonder how you can put this in perspective for the case of North Korea.
Yeah, it resonates really well with me, but I guess I should have, while listening to Azadeh earlier, I realized that I should have clarified that there's two different levels of sanctions in North Korea. One multilateral that's imposed mostly through the UN mechanism, and then another that's unilateral. And there's several countries, including actually South Korea, that has unilateral sanctions against North Korea. But obviously the most overarching one is the one imposed by the United States. And very much like in the case of Iran, there's a financial sanctions that basically cuts off all kind of banking instruments, which really impacts humanitarian work in North Korea. So, one of the divisions that Nadje just mentioned was between sort of human rights and sanctions, the folks that work on anti-sanctions and then the folks that work on human rights oftentimes tend to, work at cross purposes against each other. And I would probably say, actually, there's also in places where there's major humanitarian aid going in, that also ends up being very divisive. So for example, the human rights folks basically oftentimes talk about humanitarian aid as if it would serve to prop up the government. And so then those two groups also end up having to work at cross purposes, which I don't think actually helps people on the ground within these societies that are so severely impacted. And so I guess what I would say, and this goes to the point that Medea mentioned about the fact that for humanitarian projects, it's absolutely integral, obviously, for them to have access to the country to be able to work with the government there. So, anything that kind of rattles that or shakes that relationship is going to be a non-starter. And I was part of another, I participated just sitting in on another webinar about engaging in humanitarian work in North Korea. And they mentioned the fact that basically, unfortunately, you can't actually do both of these things. That essentially, if you get identified and pegged as doing one, that cuts off any potential for you to be able to engage in humanitarian work. And as Medea, I think, knows well, we had a retired humanitarian worker among our delegation in 2015, and she was actually having to be extremely careful about kind of taking a very public stance. And so I think we have to think very carefully when it comes to taking certain positions about how this actually impacts the people that are on the ground, within these societies that we're concerned about. And I guess I would also say, just as a historian, it's interesting to think about the history of the way that, for example, the various, I spoke earlier about the different generations of sanctions imposed on North Korea. Well, I think, the historians of the human rights development of the human rights language and legislation and norms, we know that there's a history to that as well. So there's, the so-called first generation of human rights that are about civil and political rights. And then there's the second generation that are about economic, social, and cultural rights. And then I think now there's a greater emphasis on trying to integrate those different generations of rights that are usually associated with the Cold War divisions between the West and the East, but that perhaps there's a way to bring all of these rights together under the rubric of the right to peace. And I think in the Korean case, the South Korean activists, for example, have been very adamant about the need to emphasize the right to peace, because actually without there being stability and peace, there's no way to actually reform the government or raise issues about human rights at all if people are simply dead. And so, and I actually, what I was thinking about the most as I was preparing for this webinar was, in this moment of thinking about that police brutality, is there a way that we can think about sanctions as a form of international policing? That in fact, we think that policing is a way to assure security, but as we know, it hasn't at all. And hence this movement to defund the police, because in fact, we want to fund public schools, we want to fund healthcare, we want to fund public housing, which essentially get to the root of why there are issues in the communities to begin with violence. And so I wonder whether we can apply that model to thinking about sanctions and think, is it really a non-violent way to strangle a society in this way that cuts off any possibility, even for the governments that we're wanting to sanction, that they don't themselves have the possibility to attend to the welfare of the people, because they are so preoccupied with fending off any kind of international and foreign threat. And so I wonder if there's a way that we can kind of bring, at this particular moment, of a global movement about rethinking what policing means to the international arena as well, not just domestically, but saying, is this really an effective way to think about how to sanction governments, or that is to say, to curb governments for their bad behavior? Are sanctions really effective at all? And I think each of our examples has proven that it has not been effective in any way, and that it actually has hurt the people. And in some ways, if we're going to charge these governments of holding their own people hostage, are we, with the sanctions, not doing exactly the same thing?
Excellent points, really, really excellent points. And I think there are a number of movements now rethinking sanctions. So these are very important questions that can be posed to those movements or those groups that are really rethinking sanctions and beginning a discussion from the perspective of people on the ground and how it's actually impacting civilian populations. So thank you very much, Suzy, for those thoughtful questions that you've put forth. Azadeh, to you, you've been a critic of how human rights and women's rights have been instrumentalized to justify sanctions and, regime change and possible war with Iran. Tell us a little bit about how that has played out in the Iranian context.
Thank you. I'll just quickly say in response to Suzy, I think there's a lot of space to situate and discuss sanctions as an equivalent of international policing. I think the more that we can strive to make that connection conceptually in the minds of people who are part of these anti-racism movements, it's very important, because the sort of counterterrorism kind of global regime of how that is enacted is very much the sort of mirror of domestic policing. So I think there's much space there, and I hope that we can use this moment to kind of help see those connections, show people those connections. On the way that the Trump administration has really deployed Iranian feminist movements and activism as part of its cause, I'll just kind of give a very quick overview of that. But it's really interesting to see how it's been part of the framing of the Trump administration's program from the very beginning. In May of 2019, when Secretary of State Pompeo announced his new Iran strategy, this maximum pressure campaign, economic warfare, he built Iranian women into that very speech. He said that Iranian women's struggle for inclusion and equality mattered a lot to Washington. He said that Iranian women's activism, which was very often seeking out quite peacefully or through civil disobedience means changes to discriminatory laws, that this was evidence of a growing divide between Iranians and their government. So part of the regime change narrative that was part of this new maximum pressure campaign. So he built Iranian women, the administration built Iranian women and their aspirations into this policy from the beginning, demanding freedoms on their behalf. I think it's fair to say since then that Secretary of State Pompeo has been the most concerned secretary about Iranian women in the history of the United States. The entire State Department Twitter feed has been interspersed about Iranian women protesters. And it's been quite jarring, the kind of news on the State Department or Pompeo's Twitter feed intersperses, excited news that, all of these European firms are leaving the Iranian market, kind of celebratory statistics about Iranian unemployment skyrocketing. And then right in there, congratulating a new Iranian-American female astronaut who's made it into space. So you've really been able to watch this kind of work itself out in the social media or public diplomacy or whatever they call this way of kind of bringing women's rights into the policy, saying that, the US will stand with the women of Iran. Very quickly though, apart from it just being detached from reality and quite bizarre, I think we have to really just focus on the damaging impact this has on Iranian civil society, women's activists inside the country, because it certainly has the result of securitizing their work. It is wound into, so their work is sort of wound into, especially in the media networks of a number of television networks and new media platforms that are set up, sponsored, paid for by Saudi Arabia, Media or Adversaries of Iran, VOA America, under the Trump administration, in which, you know, the celebration of Iranian women's activism is again intermingled in advocacy for regime change or sanctions. And it's intermingled in a way that, of course, Iran's security apparatus, and I think we must be very clear, as Nadje has been pointing out, that certainly will have its own reasons and motivations for suppressing women's dissent and challenge to these kind of discriminatory laws, heightens their perception of this as actually, you know, a column for regime change, worry and scrutiny of links and behavior of activists inside the country to these outside agendas. So as a result, it has been very inhibiting for the civil society sphere in Iran, already under so much pressure. The Iranian judiciary has doled out some extraordinarily severe sentences for women activists, and it's hard not to see that in the context of this situation. So actually, it has had the result of inhibiting and damaging the work of the very women that it's claiming to help.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Azadeh, and Suzy and Azadeh bringing up the issues that are happening in the United States right now makes me feel that I have to say how the US in this particular moment has even less legitimacy than ever before in trying to claim that it promotes human rights around the world when the world is looking at the United States and saying, clean up your own house first. And also, Lilia, we're very glad you're back with us. When you were talking, you were saying how the drug issues were one of the justifications for the imposition of sanctions. And of course, here we see the great hypocrisy of the United States as well, when you could look to neighboring Colombia, the great ally of the United States, as the producer of drugs, or Afghanistan. And you really have to look at the US for the consumer of drugs. And then I also think it's important when we go back to talking about Venezuela, that unlike the other countries that we've been talking about, the US has gone so far as to help anoint another person, Juan Guaido, as president of Venezuela and create a whole fictitious parallel government. And how when Americans are concerned about interference in our elections here, we really have to think about not only what we're doing economically to impose these sanctions on other countries, but in the case of Venezuela, actually creating another government while one government that has power is actually still sitting in power. So I just put that as a frame for you, Lilia, to go back to talking to us about the sanctions and the women's issues. And I'm sorry where you were cut off, but to continue on that framework.
Thank you. Thank you. Sorry for the interruption. I mean, I was going to point out that one of the main effects of U.S. sanctions in the last decade is this migration flow from Venezuela. And we have this significant amount of people who are migrating from the country, who, especially in the last 5 years, in order to look for another place to live and earn more money and to support families. Many women have migrated, leaving their children here with their grandmothers. And this has created a really dramatic situation here in Venezuela. And you can see that there is this theme and this issue with the health system, health programs intended for children and women that the U.S. sanctions have especially affected, has especially targeted in order to impulse and to create this migration flow. For instance, the vaccines would have been blocked in order to buy vaccines for a country. But at the same time, when you go to the border in Colombia, you see all these tents of the UN tents that provide vaccines to Venezuelan children. So you have to go to the border in order to get the vaccines. And you see every day this constant flow of women taking children to Colombia, to the border with Colombia in order to get vaccines. And this has created a whole new economic flow for the Colombian border, you know, like hotels, food and commerce also, that there is this constant flow of Venezuelan mothers taking their children in order to get vaccines in Cucuta, in the border with Colombia. And this is very interesting because when you see what the media have shown about the Venezuelan migration, you see that most of the coverage, most of the media coverage has focused on women, Venezuelan women. And they have taken these features with the Venezuelan women identity has been criminalized, or whether there are victims or there are victimaries. But you see every day, or well, it was more common in 2018, 2019, that you saw all these media coverage about Venezuelan migration. And you could see how women were used in order to talk about human rights. For instance, Secretary Pompeo, when he went to the UN to take Venezuela case, he talked about women, pregnant women, and women who were leaving children in the country. And these have been discourse narratives that have been used in order to justify the US sanctions on Venezuela. And it's really important to make clear that the US sanctions have deepened the polarized scenario here in Venezuela, because whether you are with the government or against the government, you have to, I mean, opposition here, for instance, they cannot criticize the US sanctions, because it's one of the main reasons that one of the main flags in order to provoke a regime change. So it's pretty much like paralyzed the whole political spectrum. You have to be with the sanctions if you are against the government, or if you have critics for the government, with the governments, you have to be with the sanctions. And that is like you have to be against your whole country, against your whole people. Because the effects are very much dramatic, and you can see it every day. I mean, we have here in Merida, in Caracas, there are like there's this sense of normality with electricity, power, gas, water. Pretty much, they have the water system in Caracas is pretty much collapsing. But here in the border with Colombia, we have the whole public services are just affected: power, water, gas, and as long as health system, and also the food supply. So when I'm gonna stop here, but I have to make clear that it has been an issue that Venezuelan women have been shown as an argument, you know, to justify U.S. sanctions on Venezuela, especially with this media coverage of Venezuelan migration.
Thank you. Lilia, did you want to ask her a question about how women, did you want to comment on how women are used to justify some of these sanctions as well, or expand a little bit about that? Can you hear me? Or?
Yes, I can hear you.
You both, I thought Medea would do. I just want to make sure both of you can comment on that, because that was actually something that was brought up with you in the preliminary discussions on this.
Yes, I started to study how media represent Venezuelan migration in 2017 because it was a very recent and significant phenomenon here in Venezuela. And when I first started to collect the corpus to see how media show this migration, I started to notice that most of the articles, most of the media issues were centered, were focused on women. Many of them were telling stories about women who died in other countries, women who were engaged in prostitution in other countries. And I started to see that women were being shown in a criminalized acts. There were victims or victimizers, because there were also cases where women were shown as they participating in a robbery or something like that. But if you see Venezuelan migration flow, there are many other aspects to show. You know, Venezuelans are working as labor in many countries, in Colombia, Chile, Peru. But if you start to study this media representation, you can notice that they were focused, especially in 2017 and 2018, they were pretty much focused on women. And they use, for instance, the role in families. They were shown as daughters who were sending money to their families in Venezuela, but they're also used they were very focused on their bodies, for instance, pregnant women, but also women who were engaged in prostitution. And they really, this media coverage was very focused on the sexuality of Venezuelan women abroad. And it's very interesting because you can see that there is there is a framing of the Venezuelan migration flow. So you have, I mean, there are many aspects to point and to talk about in media about Venezuelan migration. But if you see and study, it's especially in 2017 and 2018, Venezuelan women had a very central role in this media representation of Venezuelan migration. And this was engaged, if you see Pompeo's speech in the UN, you can see the same ideas of women who were running from a dictatorship country for their human rights. It's pretty much the same narrative that was used in the UN in order to ask for sanctions and in order to justify US sanctions on Venezuela.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm looking at the questions here. I think we don't have a lot of questions from audience, just some comments about how sanctions are basically pave the way for war, which I think is something that we and all of our panelists know, and certainly the case of Iraq has proven that to be true. It was never a deterrent to war. So I'm not sure if do you see any questions, Medea, that you?
Well, I had some sent just to me, but I think we're getting close to the time. So maybe we should go around and do one wrap up. And I think as part of the wrap up, if you could say how we could get this issue to become more of a feminist issue. How do we engage more women's groups on these issues? Or how do we use this moment, as Suzy Kim was talking about, to get more attention to this issue. It is, as you all know, a life and death issue for people, and yet it is so much under the radar. So how can we lift this up to the level that it deserves? And perhaps we should go around in the same order. Nadje?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, in terms of sanctions being not an alternative to war, but often a precursor, I mean, I think as one of the commentators, our colleague Valentine Moghadam rightly pointed out, sanctions are a form of warfare. I think that's really important. I mean, Suzy is right. I mean, in the Iraqi context, when it became so obvious that sanctions caused this incredible humanitarian crisis and death of, tens and thousands of Iraqis, so the idea of so-called smart sanctions, was supposed to be the fix of this horrible situation, but clearly it's not. I think I just want to sort of maybe go back to, what Suzy said in terms of the impossibility to be in both camps at the same time. I think while there are clearly lots of parallels between the different scenarios and cases, countries, there are also huge differences. And I think what we are tasked with is to be, very specific. So I think there is a difference when you have a situation where you have a large scale opposition outside the country. And clearly in both, that is mobilized. And I guess in both the Iraqi and the Iranian context, that opposition is in no way homogenized. I mean, it's polarized as well. And, even, of course, even with respect to, the questions of invasion, it's also not uniform inside the country. I mean, there were people in Iraq that were actually asking for an invasion. I mean, my own family, I had, some people saying yes and some people say no. I personally still want to hold on. I mean, I do understand, if it's a situation of especially, humanitarian aid, and if it's a situation of you for very urgent reasons having to travel to a country, I understand that, that there are certain red lines. But still, I want to put forward the position. I think that it is possible to do both in many contexts. I also think that we have to be very careful. Clearly, President Bush was instrumentalizing human rights and women's rights, and now we have Trump, lesser so. I mean, that's one of the big shifts, because he's not even claiming it so much anymore, except with Iran. But that doesn't mean that we should not be advocating for women's rights or human rights. I mean, and I think there was also a question amongst the participants about this whole idea of colonial feminism. And I think this whole issue of feminism either being a Western import or foreign imperialist leaders like President Bush or now Trump instrumentalizing women's rights, of course, discredits local women's rights activists. I mean, clearly now Iranian women are suffering from that, and Iraqi women suffered from that as well. But certainly the response I feel that we should engage with is not to say, oh, okay, so then we are not advocating for women's rights. But as Iraqi women or also Iranian women can profess, there's of course long history of local women's rights activism. I mean, no Iraqi or no Iranian woman needs a Western feminist to know that there are patriarchal inequalities, right? In fact, in the Middle East region, you have, since the turn of the 20th century, you have feminists who have been simultaneously mobilizing against colonial intervention and mobilizing for independence while also mobilizing for women's rights. Okay, and I think that's very important. And at the same time, I think we also need to be much more sophisticated and nuanced when we speak about Western feminism, because although I know that there are of course imperialist feminists, but I have to say most of the feminists that I know in either the UK or the US are hugely critical of their own governments and have been at the forefront of criticizing US, UK imperialism, as feminists in the Middle East region are at the forefront of criticizing authoritarian and repressive leaders. Thank you.
because I didn't get to say, I had prepared this part, but I think it's actually a good point in the discussion to bring this up. I couldn't agree more actually with Nadje's point that it's not, I don't think we should sort of cede the ground on the discussion about human rights, that it's important to bring that in. And actually, I think as a strategy, we have to actually change the terms of the discourse where those are pitted against each other. And in fact, you know, if you actually look at the UN agencies themselves, so in the North Korean case, the UN Special Rapporteur on the human rights situation in North Korea, as well as the Commission of Inquiry on Human Rights in North Korea, both of those agencies of the UN have basically said in the name of human rights that sanctions could potentially violate human rights. And I think we need to really use that language to say, you know, as much as, you know, some governments might justify sanctions as something that they're doing for the protection of human rights, we actually have to combat that and say that it's absolutely in violation of human rights. And in the process of preparing that report that was mentioned earlier about the impact of sanctions, the human cost of sanctions in North Korea, there's a UN Special Rapporteur on the negative impact of unilateral coercive measures, which is another way to say sanctions, the unilateral coercive measures and the enjoyment of human rights. And it actually deals, I think, with each of our countries actually, and perhaps even more other countries that are impacted by sanctions. And so the UN itself is actually quite aware about the impact on human rights of sanctions. And they have, I think, repeatedly suggested that the sanctions imposing countries should, including the UN, should actually conduct an impact assessment to actually see just how severe and how devastating the impacts of sanctions are and its impact on humanitarian and the human rights conditions, but that hasn't been done. So I think we really have to try, from a grassroots point of view, of trying to change that narrative where, you know, peace versus, you know, human rights, or human rights versus, you know, sanctions or anti-sanctions, that kind of false divisions, I think, really need to be dismantled.
Azadeh?
I know we're running out of time, so I will be very quick. I agree with everything that Nadje and Suzy just said. Perhaps I would just add that in addition to that, I think that there's a lot of space in the UN policy sphere and in the women, peace and security space to bring some focus back to sanctions as a feminist foreign policy issue, because I think we have a lot of interlocutors now in government. Canada has an envoy for women, peace and security. It has a formal feminist foreign policy. Many of the Nordic countries do. All these governments have WPS envoys. They're very much engaged in ideas like peace building and countering violent extremism. And I think we need to command their attention from a policy perspective to look at sanctions and to look at the way that sanctions essentially as economic warfare retards and slows women's development, as articulated by Resolution 1325. I don't think that this issue of sanctions has really penetrated that policy sphere, and everything we can do at the level of academia or civil society or in our research to command that policy space and to occupy it a little bit and to connect up the sort of conceptual linkages between the gendered impact of sanctions and all of these espoused goals that so much money and resources and rhetoric are applied to. So if you have a feminist foreign policy, what is your position on sanctions on these countries? How do you propose to mitigate that? If there's not UN assessments being done, why is that not? So just essentially trying to bring the feminist foreign policy sphere, which I think is really vibrant right now and getting some structural power in different governments, and focusing its attention on sanctions and its impact on women.
Excellent.
Well, I'll try to be very quick also. I think I'm going to speak about the situation here in Venezuela. I think we have to try to understand how these sanctions have been affecting women's lives here in the country, because we are living it and we are experiencing them, we experience the effect, but many times we just cannot see exactly how these sanctions impact on women, because we see it as a whole country problem. We see it like it's making problems and causing issues on the whole country and the whole population. But there are several issues that have been affected, especially women here, like reproductive rights or sexual rights. And there is very few information here about that. And I hear you, I hear the experience of these countries that, I mean, you have a lot more history than us on resisting sanctions. And I think we have to make more, to put more information for Venezuelan women here in order to see it as a gender problem.
Well, I'll give my final thoughts and then pass it to Sussan. One is just to say how wonderful it was to hear from all of you to understand the similarities and the differences, which we only touched the surface of, but it was a great beginning. I think, Azadeh, I'm glad you brought us into the sphere of the UN, because it is such an important place for us to go with this issue. Because it's very hard to get momentum at the national level. We've been very disappointed to see the Europeans not standing up more to the US on the sanctions. And we've also been very disappointed in our own Congress for not taking this on as a more serious issue. We've only been able to get a handful of Congress people to take this on, and that was even before the pandemic and even before the recent resurgence of the call for the Black Lives Matter. And now it's even harder to get their attention. We will continue to do so, but it's a difficult sphere for us to work in. And I just want to close on looking at the very larger issue, because I think there has been more outcry recently about these sanctions than we've heard before, certainly from the rhetorical level, at least coming from the United Nations, coming from the European Union, coming from individual heads of states. But on the broader level, I do think that it has forced a number of countries to look at how can they move beyond the dollar as the universal currency for financial transactions. And certainly the role of China has been very important in trying to counter some of these sanctions. And I know that we are living in the time of the US empire, the US superpower, and it's hard for us to think beyond that. And yet both this moment of the coronavirus and the inability of the United States to care for its own people at the same time that it's pulling out of the World Health Organization and so showing zero leadership on the global level, as well as the focus on the systemic racism in the United States, also takes away from whatever vision people still had of the United States leadership role. It does open up new possibilities. Not that we want to move from a US superpower to a Chinese superpower, but we want a multipolar world in which people can, countries can trade with each other on an open basis. And there is not one country that is trying to suffocate the others through trade or through military invasions. So there will be changes. We don't know when they come, if they're part of our lifetime, but the US is not going to be the only superpower and the head of the empire forever. Our role is to see how can we move beyond that in a way that is not as destructive as it has been for the people who are the victims of this US superpower role. Thank you.
Thank you, Medea. And I also want to thank the panelists for joining us for this really important discussion. We hope to continue it, hopefully through a collaboration with CODEPINK and FEMENA and Sanctions Kills, and maybe other organizations. We can continue this really important discussions. We have several great suggestions and ideas on how to look at sanctions from a different perspective. One, is looking at, sanctions as a policing, coercive measure at the international level, but then also relying a little bit more on the UN and the UN's role in terms of looking at the impact that it has on communities and negative impact, and how the UN can step up to mitigate some of these, some of the negative impacts of these sanctions, but also taking it to the foreign policy, to the women in foreign policy realm, which is an excellent idea. I should mention that the UN Special Procedures has a call for submissions out this fall. So if any of you are interested, I'll have to look it up. I can send you the link. So I saw that somewhere. So it might be an opportunity for people to submit to UN Special Procedures on coercive measures, which is sanctions, about how sanctions is actually impacting women and our communities and civilian populations in these countries. So this would be a great start in terms of making sure that our voices are heard at the UN level. For me, the most interesting part of this discussion, because it's so close to my heart, was that exactly those tensions between human rights and anti-sanctions or peace activists. And because I come from a movement, it's really important for me to really look at both of those. I do see sanctions as a human rights violation. It really is economic warfare. It's warfare. It's slow killing of people. It's not very different than war. And when I was in Iran, I felt the impact of these, trumped up, these more forceful sanctions when Obama implemented them in 2010. So really, they impact people's lives in very serious ways. And fortunately, in the Iranian context, even though it's so polarized, some of the activists inside the country really are articulating at great risk to themselves, both their opposition to sanctions, because it impacts Iranians' human rights negatively, but also opposition to repression, and they're standing up for human rights. Unfortunately, given the polarized environment that they're working in, their voices are often not heard. And they risk both being arrested and persecuted by the Iranian government, but then also attacked by people who are pro-sanctions and pro-regime change. So they take great risks to speak up, and the onus is upon us to try to elevate their voices. And that's why I think it's critical to have the international women's movements take up this issue and also reach out to these activists who are working in these sanctioned countries that are so incredibly isolated, but they're grappling with life and death situations and are on the brink of war, to make sure that their voices are heard. So I hope that this panel can be a step towards this direction, and that we can make sure that we get the interests of the international women's rights community, which I find often, like you, Nadje, that they do take very good positions on issues like this, that we can get them interested in the issue of sanctions and interested and committed to elevating and ensuring the participation of women from these isolated countries that are sanctioned at the international level. So I hope that we've taken a step towards that goal today. But thank you very much to all of you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Great discussion.